Institute for the Liberal Arts here at Westmont, and we are the sponsoring department for these conversations on the liberal arts at Westmont. We had a terrific keynote address yesterday from Blakey Vermeulen, who's here with us. Thank you again for that, Blakey. Blakey, you mentioned yesterday several levels of hell. One of which was a phone tree and the terrible things that happen to a person on a phone tree. You neglected to mention online police incident reports, which I've been enjoying today. So how's that for weird? That will definitely put you into a deep level of Dante's hell. We had a great lunch too. Thanks for those of you who were part of the lunch event today, where we got to hear from some of our staff members about how their liberal arts education shapes their current work. That was a neat event. So grateful to those of you who could come out for that. We've got another good afternoon in front of us. I'm going to sit down right now because taking over introducing and MC duties is going to be our colleague Rick Ostrander, who is the executive director of the Westmont Downtown program and also special assistant to the president for global programs, innovation, and new program development. So Rick, I'll hand off to you and you can take it from there.
Thank you, Chris. Not part of that long title is the fact that I'm a former American historian like our speaker today, so maybe that's what was my inroad into being able to introduce the speaker. If you weren't here yesterday, welcome to this event. You'll notice a little bit different venue than a typical guest lecture, and that's that we're in round tables. And the reason for that is in keeping with our liberal arts theme of this conference, we want this to be a dialogue, not just a lecture. So Dr. Worthen will be presenting to us, but then we'll have a brief break. There will be food and more drinks in back, including cupcakes, which are always a good thing in the middle afternoon. But then you'll have some time at your tables to reflect on and discuss the talk before we have general Q&A. So as you listen to the talk, feel free to jot down some questions and reflections that you might want to share with others at your table as we get started here. Okay? And I did promise Molly, who came here from North Carolina, not exactly the Arctic or Chicago where she and I are both from, but I did promise her some warm and sunny weather here in California, and at least we have sunny weather, if not warm, at least by our standards. So if you need to, if your body temperature goes down and you need to refill on coffee during the talk, feel free to do that as well. Molly grew up in Glen Ellyn, Illinois. We found out this morning that we attended rival high schools. She went to Glenbard West, I was Glenbard North. Of course, I attended mine much earlier than she attended hers. She earned her BA and PhD in history from Yale University, a historian of American evangelicalism and of institutions such as Westmont. She is the author of Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, which chronicles evangelical intellectual life from about 1945 to the present. Although, unfortunately, the book was published just before the rise of Donald Trump, so that would have been interesting to see it in an epilogue on that phenomenon. As assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, Molly lectures widely on religion and politics and teaches courses on North American religious and intellectual culture, global Christianity, and the history of ideas. She is also a rare example of a first-rate scholar who also communicates to the general audience. You may have seen her articles in the New York Times or the New Yorker and other major publications such as that. Her talk today is entitled Teaching Empathy, the Liberal Arts in a Post-Truth For-Profit Age. Please join me in welcoming Molly Worthen.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. It's so great to be here in person. I'm just so tired of Zoom, and this is so, even the cold air is just a nice reminder that I'm in some place getting to talk to people as a physical person and not to a screen. And it's nice to be in a room with people who are interested in these somewhat unfashionable topics that I'm going to talk about today, the liberal arts education and the idea of empathy. Both of these things have become so politicized in recent years that I think it can be hard to recover the older kind of common sense idea of what these two terms mean. But I think it's always been part of the job of colleges and universities to resist superficial, hopefully temporary currents in the culture, to be somewhat countercultural. And I think that's true for religiously affiliated and secular universities both. Let me start with empathy. And by that, I just mean the ability to understand, or at least to seek to understand, what it might feel like to be in someone else's position, inhabiting their worldview in their circumstances. This has become a pretty controversial idea among psychologists, social scientists, political activists, especially on the left. A few years ago, the Yale psychologist Paul Bloom published a really interesting book called Against Empathy, in which he argued that this effort to try to experience the world the way another human does is just inevitably wrong-headed. It is misleading, it's biased, it gives too much power to emotions, and in general, empathy, he writes, is a very poor guide to making moral decisions. He says what we really should seek is a more detached, utilitarian approach that he calls rational compassion. And over the past few decades, progressive scholars and activists have mounted a pretty sustained attack on empathy as really a condescending lie, especially when practiced by white, straight men, in which the empathizer imposes their own assumptions upon the subject and then rewards themselves with a feeling of moral superiority. In the world of arts and letters, it has become very controversial for a white writer to create a character whose visible genetic phenotype he or she does not share. I'm worried about all of this. I'm worried about the deep suspicion of empathy that I see among many colleagues who teach in the humanities, a sense that you cannot be trusted to teach or write about a people group, especially an oppressed people group, unless you are personally a member of that group, assuming therefore, that skin color and family background are far more important as qualifications for an expert than years of deep study. I think the upshot of these critiques is that it is not a good idea to strive for empathy because the human imagination will always fall short, and it will fall short in damaging ways. Therefore, there is no such thing as common humanity or human experience, and any efforts that we make at self-transcendence should really take a pretty passive form. They should take the form of silently listening to others and not really trying to put ourselves into that experience. In my own classes, I have found some students picking up on these warnings. They regularly deploy terms like cultural appropriation and intersectionality, not to start a conversation. And I think those terms can be really powerful as ways to start a conversation, but instead I hear them used instead as a signal of an ideological commitment. And I worry that students are learning to be very cynical about the potential for human understanding. On the other hand, over the past 6 or 7 years, I've heard a lot of criticisms of the mainstream liberal media for failing to understand the millions of people who voted for Donald Trump and failing to even make an effort to understand. At almost every panel or academic talk that I attended during Donald Trump's presidency, if the subject of politics and Trump came up, invariably someone in the audience would stand up during the Q&A, and usually they would be very quick to say that they themselves were a Democrat, but then they would go on to accuse journalists and academics of being condescending toward the quote-unquote Trump voter and refusing to take the task of empathy seriously. My own view is that, number one, of course, perfect empathy is impossible, of course. But, number two, civilization will fall apart if we don't strive for it. And number three, that striving is at the core of a liberal arts education. And I guess this all makes me an empathy pragmatist. Pragmatists like the philosopher William James believed that perfect truth is unattainable. But the pragmatists were not nihilistic relativists. Truth for them was an asymptote, right? It's a line that you can never coincide with. But over time, through scientific and moral progress, humans can slowly approach that line, even if they can never expect to reach it. And we can only make that progress if we are aware of our own foundational assumptions, our emotional attachments to communities and prejudices, and we try to hold all of these things lightly and dearly at the same time, with a mix of commitment and self-criticism. And this effort, of course, it will necessarily be imperfect, but at least it will be a bit self-aware. We'll be kind of aware of the hazards. I really appreciated the book that the Christian philosopher Jamie Smith published a few years ago called Who's Afraid of Cultural Relativism, in which he makes the case for Christian pragmatism. And he says this posture of epistemological humility is not a secular thing, it's not a seeker thing, it's just the most responsible way to move through the world as a depraved mortal. I was looking at the essay on the Westmont College website called What We Want for Our Graduates. I love that essay. Whoever wrote it, I just love it. And I was struck by how this essay is basically an expression of Christian pragmatism. The hope that graduates will have core convictions, but, and here I'm quoting, be open to alternative interpretations, weigh evidence fairly, and in general, function self-critically. This pragmatist view of empathy is definitely on the retreat, both in academia and I think in our wider political culture. And I want to turn now to two, I guess you could call them intellectual habits, two different habits of mind, one on the left and one on the right, that I worry are turning folks in the higher ed space, but also Americans generally, into great empathy skeptics. As humans, I think we all like to believe that we are privy to occult secrets. We love to think that we have gone through some kind of initiation that allows us to see what is really going on in the world while everyone else is kind of stumbling around with bags over their heads. And when a book or a teacher claims to introduce us to some kind of hidden truth, it's really exciting, It's like the ancient Gnostics who preached that Christian teachings needed to be flipped upside down in order to really reveal the divine. And when you're one of the few who has this secret revelation, it's really flattering. It tells us, you're in the know. I'm going to focus on the cultural influence of two men that I think of as kind of Gnostic high priests, you could say, on either side of the political aisle. And on the left, I'm going to talk about the philosopher Michel Foucault, and on the right, the evangelical culture warrior Francis Schaeffer. Now you're probably thinking, Foucault, oh no, this is going to be a total slog of a lecture. I promise I am not going to get into the nuances here for our purposes. I'm not interested in like a close reading of Foucault or Schaeffer. I'm more interested in the vague, oversimplified, sometimes slightly wrong ways in which their ideas are understood by the vast majority of people, which is to say, people who have typically not read any of their work and might not even know how to spell their names, but are sort of picking up on catchphrases and impulses in the culture around them. That's what I'm interested in. So let's start with the legacy of Foucault, the French philosopher. A lot of people on the left, students, activists, many academics, have taken from Foucault, whether they realize it or not, I'd say, they've taken a simple but profound observation. And that is that everything is about power. Not just that, but people who have power spend a lot of trying to make their power so ubiquitous that it becomes totally embedded in life, almost invisible. This assumption then becomes a kind of master lens for understanding politics, history, art, economics, everything. All of human life becomes like one of those 3D images where you stare at the random dots for long enough and like suddenly you see the image of power with a capital P coming out from the image. In academic work in particular, this means that the main point of what we're doing in the classroom and in our writing ought to be exposing these hidden power dynamics and announcing their injustice. Here is how Foucault put it in one of his lectures collected in the book, Society Must Be Defended. He was talking about the discipline of history in particular, but the basic idea goes for all academic study, I think, as far as Foucault was concerned. He said that the moral thing for scholars to do is engage in their study and teaching as a protest, a critique, and an oppositional discourse. That's his language. On the eve of Trump's inauguration, the anthropologist Paul Stoller wrote an article in the Huffington Post in which he called for scholars to resist Trump by getting together and reading Foucault, which I thought was interesting. I see this basic posture as the default position of many kind of left-leaning people in higher education. And I doubt most of them have read Foucault, certainly not closely. Only the most advanced among the students who think this way would invoke him explicitly. But in my courses on North American religion and intellectual history, I see that some students are not primarily interested in understanding the arguments of the text itself, except insofar as it's kind of pragmatically necessary to do all right in the class. The questions that are really at the front of their minds are, whom does this text exclude and oppress, and what is my duty to those people? Now, don't get me wrong, those are important questions, but they're not the only questions. One question that does not seem to come up really at all is, how might true freedom be possible? Foucault seemed to have total contempt for anybody who thought that it was actually possible, even for the most woke among us, or whatever language you like, to escape the iron cage of modernity. You just can't do it. Even the scholar and the super aware, politically savvy social critic is still a cog in, as he put it, the panoptic machine, invested by its effects of power, which we bring to ourselves since we are part of its mechanism. Here's what the Marxist philosopher Marshall Berman wrote about the strange appeal of this sense of knowing victimhood in his book, All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, which is a great book. I really love that book. He wrote, Foucault offers a generation of refugees from the 1960s a world historical alibi for the sense of passivity and helplessness that gripped so many of us in the 1970s. There is no point in trying to resist the oppressions and injustices of modern life, since even our dreams of freedom only add more links to our chains. However, once we grasp the total futility of it all, at least we can relax. The problem with this worldview is that first, it prevents its disciples from wanting to learn how to gain and manage power in serious, humane, real-world ways. I think it encourages students and also faculty, kind of thinking about the teaching they want to do, the books they want to write, to steer away from subjects like the history of statecraft, or the history of war, the American presidency, things like this. These topics get tagged as somehow inherently conservative. Avoiding the history of power as it has been practiced in the West, because that story happens to be mostly an account of white men, I think does people who are interested in the future of society and kind of what it is to be human, it does all of us a disservice. It shrinks the questions that we learn to ask. It shrinks the ambitions that we cultivate. The second problem is that this fixation on exposing power becomes, in classroom conversation or in scholarly projects, it becomes an anti-intellectual, anti-humanist hammer that flattens out multiple complex dimensions of human life and thought. That hammer flattens the subject, but it also, I think, it pounds a solid wall between the subject and the student, the person trying to understand, by suggesting that, if you try to understand the worldview of, Napoleon, Thomas Jefferson, whoever, that this is to somehow endorse a power grab, that you are participating in this act of imperial subjugation if you're trying to understand historical actors who wielded power. Third, this posture assumes that the main point of intellectual inquiry is critique, deconstruction, and that it's not so much about discovery and positive creation. Now, sure, at some level, one person's idea of deconstruction is another person's idea of discovery, but the distinction in attitude, the difference in our narratives about what we're doing in academia, I think it's really crucial, what our ultimate purpose is. I see a lot of students and faculty becoming increasingly cynical about Americans' common life together and inclined to see the university as kind of a citadel of righteousness and resistance rather than an institution that serves the common life. Now, when social commentators try to tell the story of how American political culture got to where it is today, with so many Americans dismissing the mainstream media as fake news, they frequently gesture toward this kind of confusing bogey of postmodernism. And the more elaborate versions of this pop diagnosis sometimes invoke Foucault by name, although as far as I can tell, he himself rejected that label, postmodern. Now, it is, of course, correct to link Foucault with a certain skepticism about truth claims, because for him, knowledge is power in disguise. The idea of our postmodern political moment is a cliche, right, at this point. And like most cliches, it contains some truth. But I think that the fake news phenomenon has even longer roots on the American right. And these are roots that actually anticipated and exacerbated the left-leaning postmodern suspicion of empiricist truth claims. These are roots that are, they go back centuries in certain American subcultures. And to get into this, I want to talk about the evangelist Francis Schaeffer, who had a 20-year career speaking, publishing, making films before he died in 1984, which happens, incidentally, to be the same year that Foucault died. Now, I'm using Schaeffer as a representative of a much broader and complex tradition. I think you could argue that he was a kind of right-wing Gnostic high priest who became the greatest popularizer of a set of ideas that have had really important effects on conservative Christian America and have seeped into conservatism more generally. And they're not unlike the influence of Foucault on the left. Even though Schaeffer and Foucault, it's hard to imagine two more different thinkers. So let me back up a little bit on this question of how red and blue Americans came to occupy kind of alternative realities, and conservatives came to dismiss outlets like the New York Times and CNN as fake news. It seems to me that white American evangelicals have a long tradition of defending their view of biblical authority, their ideas about social norms, against the incursions of modern scholarship and secular experts. This tradition goes back a long way. It goes back to how theologians, responding to the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, came up with highly rationalistic, one might even say uncharitably, a kind of pseudo-scientific way of defending Scripture that really tried to answer science on its own terms, on terms set by science, presenting the Bible as really a science textbook and debunking secular experts in this style. When conservatives responded to the higher biblical criticism coming out of German universities in the 19th century, they argued that these debates over the historicity of the Gospels, things like this, were not just about the claims of a particular passage in the Bible, but this was about fending off an attack on the authority of God himself, a scholarly project based on atheistic assumptions. And it was those assumptions that were the real danger, the real problem. At the same time, I'd say most Christians, certainly most evangelicals, if we're talking about the 19th century, still thought that evangelism called them to argue rationally with non-Christians. They had faith in what we'd call natural theology, that is, using evidence from the natural world, evidence that anyone can access regardless of their metaphysics, to argue for the existence of God. Now, I'm making a lot of big generalizations and simplifications here, but I think they're useful. But then in the late 19th century, the Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper laid the groundwork for a new way of thinking about how Christians should argue with non-Christians. So we are still broadly on this question of empathy, in a sense, and how you talk to and understand someone different from yourself. Think about kind of how they might be coming at a problem. Kuyper moved away from natural theology, from trying so hard to prove the truth of Christianity with empirical evidence available to us all. And he focused instead on presuppositions, on the foundational assumptions that distinguish a Christian worldview from a materialist one. This way of thinking came into full bloom, you could say, at Westminster Theological Seminary outside of Philadelphia, in a school of thought known as presuppositionalism. There are a number of thinkers associated with this school, but there's one guy in particular who really stands out, and that's Cornelius Van Til, whose career spanned roughly from the 1930s to the 1960s. Van Til thought that it was basically hopeless for Christians to try to persuade non-Christians through reasoned argument because, he said, one can only accurately interpret evidence out there in the world if you are proceeding from the correct assumptions, the most important being the assumption of the inerrant truth of the Bible. So if you take this position, it gives you a pretty handy way to dismiss arguments or information that you don't like. You just say that your opponent's assumptions, presuppositions, must be wrong. And voila, it's fake news. You don't have to engage with it. I spent a lot of time in my last book tracing the influence of this way of thinking on some of the leading evangelical evangelists and public intellectual types, people like Francis Schaeffer, who studied with Van Til and became a kind of wandering cultural prophet among American evangelicals from the 1960s into the 1980s. Probably many of you know his work. He sold a ton of books. He made a couple of epic Kenneth Clark-style documentaries about the decline of the Christian West. He played an enormous role in mobilizing the evangelical pro-life movement, among other things. Schaeffer and folks like him brilliantly used presuppositionalism, packaged in a slightly different way, packaged in the language of the Christian worldview versus the secular humanist worldview, to give evangelicals a way to talk back to secular scholarship and feel that they had emerged victorious, that they were more savvy than their opponents. I think when Trump began denouncing, dismissing information he didn't like, he was kind of unwittingly capitalizing on a long history of evangelical intellectual practice, because evangelicals are old hands at rejecting difficult facts as fake news. If you follow the logic of this tradition, then if you expose the presuppositions of secular experts, you uncover the hidden agenda of atheism, you find an effort to advance a militantly anti-Christian vision under the guise of imposing supposedly neutral rules on the public square and intellectual discourse. So here's what's interesting. What happens then, if this is your framework, a truth claim by those secular experts, it becomes a power grab. A power grab aimed at a persecuted, marginalized, subaltern conservative Christianity. So from a certain angle, you see a kind of echo of Foucault here. And as with the parallel syndrome on the left, I think conservatives who take this view find it gives them the empowering feeling of the scales falling from their eyes, and they suddenly see the world as it really is, and see the traps laid out for them. There are a couple of more common patterns to notice here. One is that at the core of each of these two Gnosticisms, on the right and on the left, is a basically correct and important insight, and I want to emphasize this. And that is, yes, humans seek power. And yes, we build our quest for power into many of the things we do and the stories we tell ourselves. And yes, everyone has a set of foundational assumptions. And we may be only dimly aware of them, but they frame our reasoning and our reactions to the world. And so recognizing these things are as important for interpreting a text in the classroom as they are for making sense of Facebook posts during a political campaign. Yet it seems to me that both these mental habits are the very opposite of the critical thinking skills that students are supposed to be learning, that faculty are supposed to be modeling, because they encourage us to pass new evidence through a formula and arrive at a basically predetermined conclusion, rather than reasoning for ourselves. Both habits of thought also destroy any sense of common human experience or mutually accessible reality that we can share, which are key prerequisites for the pragmatist critical empathy that I mentioned earlier. Both urge on that human tendency toward self-flattery, and they provide a really cheap and crippled sense of solidarity, the identity politics which have become so dominant across our political spectrum on the left and the right. So how can scholars, teachers, students, how can we all respond to this situation? I have a few ideas. These are all very general. I hope some more will come out of our conversation in a few minutes. First, I think that we need to get better at teaching students the difference between bias and argument. Bias and argument, they're not the same thing. I've noticed in my classes that my students love to point out the quote-unquote bias of the authors that we read, and they often think that identifying hidden unfair prejudices is the main point of reading, and once you figure that out, you're done, because that bias undermines any logical claims that the author might make. This is a way in which these patterns that I've been mentioning on both the right and the left have yielded a kind of muddled cynicism that is not particularly political. It's just lazy and bad thinking. I think we can be attentive to an author's assumptions, his or her context, all that stuff, while also taking seriously how they use evidence to advance their claims. And we can teach our students how to test that evidence against other sources and see truth as complex rather than non-existent. Second, I think we should try as often as possible to model for students, for one another, what it looks like to really plumb the worldview of someone you disagree with. Now, that's different from modeling civil debate, which is also super important, but they're two different things. I like to think that if you seek out conversations with colleagues who are publicly maybe great critics of empathetic teaching and learning, very skeptical of it, you might find more common ground than you expected, and that they have insights, even though they seem to disagree with you, they might have insights into how we can all do this stuff better in the classroom. When I was researching this topic recently, I was looking for really vociferous critics of the idea of empathy, and I called up a professor in the English department at Florida State University named Alicia Gaines. Her scholarship is focused very much on the problems with the white efforts to understand and write about the black experience. And she stressed to me in our conversation her skepticism of empathy, her focus on how these human efforts play out in the context of institutions and power, as she put it. But she also went on and on about how formative reading novels like Anne of Green Gables was for her as a child, and how in her classroom she wants to give students the emotional space to connect with literature, no matter what their own background is. She was also leery of giving students the impression that if they happen to look like a novel's protagonist or look like a historical figure, then they automatically have an infallible understanding of that person or character. She told me about a seminar that she teaches on African American intellectual or African American literature, where she had to intervene to shift this dynamic. And I'm just going to quote her at length because I think her account of this is super interesting. Here's what she said. The white students, being a particular meticulous type of white student who would take an upper-level African-American class, there weren't many in the class, and they figured out we should let the people of color talk. They became a silent white minority. And there was the vocal, sometimes not historically accurate, black majority. I had to quash that. I had to honor the fact that this is the first time you're seeing a professor who looks like you on a topic about you, and that feels good and it's empowering, but let's realize that black doesn't mean a monolithic thing. And we want to engage each other with more nuance. So I had that conversation and broke up the cliques and said, y'all can't sit together anymore. And then I threw something at them that I knew they wouldn't know. I told them that Sojourner Truth didn't actually say, ain't I a woman? So they could realize, hey, I'm a black citizen who also needs to relearn some things about American history. I had to shake them up so we can all be a bit vulnerable. I really love what Professor Gaines said here. I think she captures that careful dance that we do in our classes, at least on our better days. And our conversation helped me see that it's unhelpful and it's usually wrong to put our colleagues and our students into neat boxes of woke and right-wing or whatever your handy labels are. If we take the time to talk to each other, especially one-on-one, yes, sometimes we will get into arguments and have all of our worst assumptions confirmed. That will sometimes happen. But other times we will find that we're not as far apart as we thought. We should recognize that both liberals and conservatives have a lot to lose as the current neoliberal or market-obsessed authorities continue to reshape higher education, to slash course offerings that don't immediately seem to translate into cash value, to meet the problem of growing numbers of struggling, underprepared students by basically finding ways to dumb down our programs and come up with metrics as a substitute for the real and quite expensive problem solving that probably does need to happen. Now, what does this have to do with empathy, you may wonder? That brings me to my third suggestion, which is that we need to teach courses and read books that concern themselves with moral philosophy. And I don't just mean in philosophy departments. I mean, I think any literature course, any history course is at its core about the great questions of moral being in the world. We shouldn't pitch this to students as just a matter of cultural literacy. We need to convince them that they are our partners in this great, I think it's really the great philosophical project of our time. And that is, number one, getting comfortable with what the poet John Keats called negative capability. That is, the ability to sit in uncertainty. This came up at the lunch today, for those of you who were here, and we're talking about the value of the liberal arts, teaching us just to accept that we don't know everything, and we need to resist the temptation to explain away or dismiss people and things that we don't understand. And number two, the need for this negative capability does not mean that we should stop trying to figure out a universalistic moral framework that actually works for the crazy, pluralist, messy society that we are in. To me, this is the great debate among intellectual historians, among public thinking people generally today. That is, does secular modernity actually have a coherent moral order of its own, even if it often falls short, or is it basically running on the fumes of Christendom? And those fumes are destined to run out eventually. When I think of the great modern liberal thinkers who have made the case for a secular moral universalism, a morality that tries to harness the best features of the liberal traditions, focus on individual autonomy while disciplining its worst excesses. And I'm thinking of people like E.M. Forster, James Baldwin, Hannah Arendt. Their writings often boil down to a call for empathy. They had faith that what Adam Smith called our moral sentiments are core to what it is to be human and make meaningful, empathetic effort possible. I think of that great line toward the end of the novel Howard's End, only connect, live in fragments no longer. That is, build bridges between yourself and other human beings and strain to see the world from their point of view. Personally, I find this to be a kind of reasonably coherent philosophical position. A long tradition of liberal thinkers since the Enlightenment, with some ancient precursors, have made the case that you don't need religious presuppositions to do this moral work. And even the most cursory look at history, I think, shows that religion is sometimes as much an enemy to empathy and goodwill as it is a friend. Yet, psychologically, socially, a set of texts and ideas, however persuasive it is, kind of at the rational level, it cannot do what dense cultures of religious communities do with their stories, their webs of cradle to grave ritual and social practice that bind members together and give them a sense of continuity over time and persuade them that their ideology is not just a moral order, but a way of life. I think we are facing a growing epidemic of moral and metaphysical shallowness, where self-help books about mindfulness and anti-anxiety medications, it all just papers over a giant void. I think we're all increasingly a lot like another character in Howard's End, the wealthy widower Henry Wilcox. Here's E.M. Forster again. Outwardly, he was cheerful, reliable, and brave, but within all had reverted to chaos, ruled so far as it was ruled at all by an incomplete asceticism. That's often the best case scenario. I worry that liberal thinkers have not taken seriously the arguments advanced by the long tradition of critics of liberalism, that is, critics from the left and critics from the right. People like Herbert Marcuse, Marshall Berman, Charles Taylor, Alistair McIntyre, Robert George, Patrick Deneen, all people who have pointed out the internal contradictions within secular liberal ideology and have warned against the optimistic faith that we're getting better, that liberalism just needs to be fixed rather than fundamentally reconceived. We need students to care about this problem, to see that participating in this project of figuring this stuff out, this is the point. This is the point of a liberal arts education. Now, will we all learn to be more empathetic citizens in the process? Maybe, I hope so. But more importantly, I hope we will at least see what's at stake in attempting to do this impossible thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Molly. Well, that gave us a lot to think and reflect on. So what we're going to do, I see we do have food set up in back, so to try to have some sense of orderliness here, let's start on my right, so the lucky group over here. If you can start and take both lines of the table to get some food, and then we'll just kind of move across the room. So if you're waiting, feel free at your tables to ask some questions, talk among yourselves about some possible takeaways and what questions you would want to ask Dr. Worthen once we reconvene. So it'll probably take about 10 to 15 minutes for people to move through the line, and then we'll reconvene and have some Q&A, okay? So feel free to start.